Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how are you today? In today's video, we are going to continue with the second episode, of the Great Depression. And we had everything but money, So, selling fish and berries helped make ends meet. I was 7 years old when the banks closed, too young to know we were in a depression. I just thought we were poor, but that didn't seem unusual. Everyone we knew was in the same predicament. My father, along with millions of others, was out of work. When we could no longer pay the rent and other bills, we moved in with my grandparents, and my father and uncle opened a fish market in a small cinder block building they rented behind the house. There was no refrigeration then, except for the blocks of ice delivered by the iceman in a horse-drawn wagon. So we had to eat any fish that was left over at the end of the day. At the time, I thought I never wanted to eat fish again. Now that I'm grown, of course, going to a nice seafood restaurant is a treat. We also picked wild blackberries and sold them door to door during those years. When the berries ripened, Mama, Daddy, my brother and sister and I would go out about 7:30 a.m. to a narrow old road about 4 blocks from our house where the berries were thick. We'd pick until noon, then go home for a lunch of hot biscuits with Caro syrup. After lunch, my brother and I would go out and sell the berries for 10 cents to 15 cents a quart. We'd take whatever money we had made home to Mama, who would decide what groceries to purchase with it, and then send us back out to the corner to buy food for supper. If we had any berries left over, we'd have them with sugar and cream for dessert. Mama thought this was a real treat for us, but it was the last thing we wanted. We always seemed to eat as many berries as we picked, and we ate them the whole time we were trying to sell them. My brother and I walked 8 blocks to and from school every day, no matter how hot or cold it was. We were never let out of school because of the weather, as students are today. We'd walk home for lunch, which was usually a warmed can of pork and beans with biscuits. If it was raining, we had to eat lunch at school, as our shoes had holes in the bottom that were covered with cardboard. On those days, our grandmother would give us a dime each so we could buy a carton of milk and a bowl of soup. I don't think we even knew when the Depression ended, as it seemed we were always poor. Even after my dad got a job as a salesman, yet the hard times didn't seem to hurt any of us. It's made us appreciate everything we have now. In 1987, I wrote a book about my life as a child and gave a copy to each of my 6 grandsons. They all thought it was the best gift they ever received. Until then, I don't think they could imagine life without television and ice makers, fast foods, and pizzas, and all the other things they take for granted. It was hard for them to understand that not everyone had a telephone then, and that I had no pictures of that time because we didn't own a camera. But there were always things to do that didn't cost any money. In both good times and bad, our parents always had time for us. We never had much money, but we had all the love our parents could possibly give their children. Hard times come and go, and the Bible tells us that the poor are always with us. Those of us who were children in the 1930s remember how hard times could really be. The Canadian Pacific Railway was the mainstay of Lyndon, Vermont, where I lived with my parents and 3 brothers. Nearly everyone in the town depended on the railroad, directly or indirectly, to keep food on the table. As the economy worsened, the railroad passed out 10% wage cuts, and there was no union or negotiating them to protest. There were temporary layoffs, which meant workers put in only 2 or 3 days a week. There were Few telephones, so public notices of layoffs were posted on bulletin boards. Workers had no Social Security, old age pensions, or unemployment compensation to fall back on, and people were expected to work as long as they were physically able, and there was no such thing as early retirement. It was every man for himself. Every able-bodied man and woman, and plenty of children too, worked at something to bring in $1 here and there. In season, people picked berries to sell house to house. Some picked dagger ferns to sell to florists. Men turned out to shovel snow or work on town roads for $1 a day. Women and girls were glad to work in the home of others who could afford to pay $2 or $3 a week plus board for help in the house. Folks living on farms had a little easier. Those who had enough to feed usually kept a cow, one pig, a bull calf, a flock of hens. That would be called subsistence farming today, but in those days it made for a pretty good living. Bread, milk, pea soup, Johnny cake, and oatmeal were the staples of many diets. When we were very poor, we ate better than many do today, my mother said later, and so we did. With our own meat, milk, homemade bread, butter, and cheese, all the fresh fruits and vegetables and home-canned foods, we ate like kings. Welfare budgets were slim, and it was only out of sheer desperation that anyone applied to the overseer of the poor for help, and records were carefully kept, and the amounts charged against each person were posted in the annual town report for all to see. Recipients were expected to pay back every cent as soon as they were able. And those people felt great relief as credits were posted next to their names. Folks would have preferred to starve than ask for help from the town, though being on the town was viewed more fear than death itself. Vermonters had always known about using it up, wearing it out, and making it do going without, so most of them weathered the hard times. At least one family in our town was known to have their horse and cow living in the family quarters to keep them from freezing to death, and the children had to take turns going to school because there wasn't enough footwear or clothing to go around. Those same children grew up to be the decent citizens and living honorable lives. After Franklin Roosevelt became president, relief came through various reform programs. Many men found work in the Civilian Conservation Corps on nearby Burke Mountain and in other camps all over America. The Work Progress Administration provided work on bridges and highways and buildings and supported some writers' projects. None of these jobs paid more than a few dollars, but they did offer the dignity of work for pay and proved to be the salvation of many. By 1931, the highways of our nation were filled with men searching for jobs. They weren't like the typical tramps of the years before the Depression. They were young men who had just graduated from high school or college and should have been looking forward to a bright future. They were older men who worked all their lives, and they were men who'd once had successful careers in business. Now all of them were searching for any job to be found. My husband was one of the fortunate ones. He was a school superintendent with a good salary and a 3-year contract. But my heart went out to those other men whose lives had suddenly been thrown into confusion and chaos through no fault of their own. We lived in Falfurrias, Texas, which had a warm climate and plenty of seasonal jobs. So many of the wanderers passed our way. It was also a rest stop for many who were traveling onward to the Rio Grande Valley, and there was a large hobo camp under one of the railroad bridges. During the winters of 1931 and 32, hardly a day passed that I didn't have one or more hobos at my door asking for a cup of coffee and a bite to eat, or a small job they could perform for a quarter or 50 cents. If my husband was home, we often invited the man in to eat at our table and visit to bit. If he wasn't home, I didn't invite the men in, but I always had something to give them. I recall one older man who'd been promised a job pouring concrete at a filling station that was being built. That job wouldn't start for a week, so he went to the valley to look for work in the interim. And when he returned, he found the concrete pouring job had started earlier than expected, and the job had gone to another man. We made a couple of small jobs for him, invited him in for a meal and a visit. He was so intelligent, told such interesting stories that we really hated to see him leave. Another one I recall was a handsome, fair-haired youth, about 18 years old, who asked for neither food nor work, but for a 5-gallon can. He spent the night in the hobo camp and stayed behind when the others left in the morning. He wanted to take a bath, but needed a good-sized can to heat the water. The worst thing about being on the road, he said, was the lack of privacy and the difficulty of keeping clean. When Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, he began to put programs into effect that would provide jobs and fair wages and take the wanderers off the road. It took time, of course, but by 1935, we were at least on the way to recovery. The 1930s were tough years. There were no jobs to be had. When the farmers weren't hiring, thousands of us rode boxcars from place to place in hopes of earning a few pennies. Sometimes, when there weren't any boxcars, we rode on the top of trains, no matter what the weather was like. Anyone who remembers those days can vouch for the yard bulls who worked in the railway terminals. We'd keep out of sight, wait for the highball, which signaled the train was about to leave. That was the time you climbed aboard, if the bull caught you, you were herded into a special housing area at the rail yard and then put on a work train and sent out to repair the tracks. The railroad still owes me a few cents for some of the work I did. On one occasion, about 300 of us climbed aboard an eastbound freight train in Laurel, Montana. Those riding with us through the dark night, including a man and his wife and their young daughter, who was perhaps 10 years old. On that trip, I found a few days' work somewhere in the Bitter Root Valley of Montana, bleaching celery. Yes, celery was bleached in those days. Riding inside a boxcar or on top of the train was a dangerous way to travel. All of us were looking for work, but some were more desperate than others. If you had any money, you had to be careful. There was always the chance that other hobos might team up and overpower you so they could take it. A hobo also had to guard against the theft of his bindle. It's a bedroll consisting of a piece of canvas wrapped around some blankets. When there was no work to be found, we had no money for food. We sometimes went back to the doors of cafes and restaurants. No one ever wanted to the front door for a handout, to which, for the floor sweeper, getting a word to him would help us get a sandwich, which was usually just a bit of a leftover meat, 2 thin slices of bread, but was usually enough to tide us over for a few hours. We never went through garbage cans for food. The cans usually contained only ashes and a few empty tin cans. It was better to try a home in an outlying area of town and ask the lady of the house for a few sandwiches. I remember one very generous lady who had just served a meal but hadn't cleared the table yet. She asked me to come in and wash up and then served me chicken, potatoes, and homemade gravy. It reminded me of the days when I was living at home and my own mother's cooked food like that. When you were riding the rails, such meals were few and far apart. Still, thanks to the generosity of those who shared their food with us, I can honestly say I never went hungry. Our house in Welch, Louisiana wasn't far from the railroad tracks, so we saw a lot of hobos. They were riding the rails, getting a day's work on occasion, and then sending $1 or $2 back to their families. Some stopped at our house to ask for something to eat. A lot of them would say, "Just a slice or 2 of bread will be fine, ma'am." But one hobo was selling something for a nickel. I bought one, and I'm still using it today whenever I hang my curtains. It's just a piece of wire with two prongs, but it makes curtains slide onto the rod slick as a ribbon. That little gadget has been a lifesaver over the years. Everyone in the family knows its history, and they all want to inherit it. Christine Roan Hollins, Auburn, Kentucky. Grandma kept table for the travelers. I was far luckier than most during the Depression. I was able to be raised by my grandparents in a small Alabama town on Route 80, and the only coast-to-coast highway in the nation. Granddaddy was the depot agent for the Southern Railway, and Grandma, who we called Nanny, ran a gas station and general store on the highway. For a long time, the worst thing that happened was when the railroad cut Granddaddy's pay. Others weren't as fortunate. We'd see the whole families walking on Highway 80 past Nanny's store. Their few possessions on their backs, the pieces of old automobile tires tied to their feet in place of shoes. Nanny had a warm, loving heart, and she couldn't hear or bear to see hardship. She had to do something to help. Whenever she spotted those wanderers, she sent them to our house 2 blocks away for a hot meal. She and Priscilla, our cook and housekeeper, kept a big table set up on the backyard, and there was always a big pot of beans on the stove and hot cornbread in the oven. Nanny also told Balo, our hired man, to find something for the men to do, even if it was just cutting wood for the fireplaces, so they could feel they've done work for the food, weren't getting a handout. Nanny was a wise woman. She knew those people had needs that went beyond hunger. Their spirits needed to be fed too. There was something eating at the table almost every day. When the weather was bad, Priscilla fed our guests on the long-screened porch that ran alongside the house. Thankfully, food was no problem for us. We kept chickens and raised a couple of little pigs each year and kept serving several milk cows, and pear, cherry, peach trees provided us with jams and jellies and preserves, and we could easily find persimmons and wild plums and dewberries and blackberries in the woods near the house. Granddaddy and Balo produced a bumper crop of vegetables each year, which Nanny and Priscilla preserved in shelf after shelf of fat mason jars. Much of that food was shared with others who were less fortunate. Nanny's generosity eventually cost her store. She let many of her customers charge their purchases and continued extending their credit, even when she knew they couldn't repay her. She just couldn't bear to see those people do without. I don't know if Nanny ever collected the debts that were owed to her, but I do know that she and Granddaddy paid off every penny they had owed, bankrupt or not. They were both fiercely honest people. My grandparents taught me a lot about life. They taught me not to judge a book by its cover, and that money means nothing compared to decency and character. Evelyn Martin, Lakeland, Florida. Although I was a young housewife, home alone with my babies, I was never afraid of the men they called hobos. They were just down on their luck, looking for work and hungry. My husband kept a sawhorse where the hobos could see it, with a railroad tie ready to be cut into lengths to fit into the stove. On most occasions, while I was fixing my guest a big beef sandwich, he'd go to work on sawing the railroad tie. Afterward, I'd bring a basin of warm water, some soap, and a towel. The men seemed to appreciate having a chance to wash their hands and face. Sometimes I'd send the men off with an extra sandwich and cookies. Sometimes they'd just sit on the steps and visit for a while. Most of them were family men trying to make a few bucks to send home. I had no money, as those hard times were, even with my husband working. But I could share what food we had. God bless those dear souls carrying on. Pauline Clark, Helena, Montana. When I was 3 years old, my whole body was covered with bandages because of a rash I had for my entire short life. In our small town of 500 people, everyone knew about my condition, and the word spread to the local hobo camp as well. One day, a hobo came to my father's store, said he was a doctor, and asked if he could see me for a few minutes. My father was desperate to find a cure for me, so he agreed. The hobo looked me over, then asked for permission to use the town druggist's lab. 15 minutes later, he gave my father a small jar of ointment. The hobo told my father to put the ointment on my rash and to take me off of cow's milk. A week later, the rash was gone, and it never returned. I'm now 84 plus. I think about that hobo often, and I will always be grateful to him for the help he gave me. Earl E. Haight, Seattle, Washington. When the Depression began, many men found themselves wandering without a job or a place to live. One summer, those wanderers not only touched my life, but taught me some important lessons. I was a child who loved the outdoors, especially the little stream that passed under a bridge near our county house. One day, I slipped down the bank to explore under the bridge, and I saw a man kneeling beside the water. I scrambled back up the bank and headed for home, but I carried with me a mental picture. The man held a small piece of broken mirror in his left hand and a safety razor in his right. He had been shaving. Back at home, Mother explained that he must have been out for a job. Maybe he was looking for work. Maybe he was returning home. But whatever his circumstances, he wanted to keep up his appearance. He still had his pride. Hard times hadn't taken that away from him. The second wanderer knocked on our door late one morning and asked if we could share some food with him, perhaps a sandwich. Mother had not yet fixed lunch and had no meat ready, but she said she could give him bread and butter sandwich if that would help. He accepted it gratefully. My third encounter that summer was not with just a person, but a whole family. They had driven their Model A Ford into the woods and were camping there, cooking over an open fire and using tree branches and twigs around them to make baskets. The baskets were square and sturdy, made of 8-inch lengths of wood, with bent branches for handles. Whenever they finished enough baskets, the children would sell them door to door for 20 cents each. I was only 9 years old, but I learned several lessons from those wanderers. They have stayed with me all of my life. Keep your pride, be grateful for gifts, and use your initiative and skills to provide for your family. During the early years of the Depression, I was living with my grandparents in the heart of San Francisco. The hobos would always come directly to our house, skipping every other house in the block. We'd see them coming up the street looking at each house before stopping at ours. My grandmother was a kind and caring person, and she never turned anyone away. She'd say in her sweet way, "Just sit down on the stairs and I'll bring you something to eat." Grandma always had a pot of homemade soup on the stove, so the menu was a bowl of soup, a sandwich, a cup of hot coffee, and something sweet. Our guest was given a bell to ring when he was finished, and Grandma would take all the dishes and wash them and put them on the top shelf of the pantry ready for the next visitor. Even though the men were strangers and we never made conversation, somehow we weren't ever afraid. The hobos were soft-spoken and polite, and they appeared grateful for a simple meal. My aunt and I would watch them through the curtains as they sat on the porch in the damp San Francisco fog, cradling a hot cup of coffee in their hands. As they walked away into the mist, we often wondered where they were going and where they'd get their next meal. We also wondered why these men singled out our house for their stops. One day we'd find out. A friend had been to the train station downtown and had stopped to make a phone call. There, clearly printed on the wall of the phone booth, was our address. Another form of the hobo code. Barbara Allen, Novato, California. All right, guys, that's all for this video. I will see you in episode 3. Stay safe, stay positive, keep prepping, and as always, fearless.